Now, he felt confident in this because at this stage, France was weak. King Charles VI was barely sane, and there was a civil war between the two most likely successors. Henry watched this. He built up his forces and he declared war in July 1415, assembling an army of 2,500 men-at-arms plus 8,000 archers at Southampton. Now, the organization and administration of the English army had by now improved even further than King Edward III's time. It was a professional force. Captains of bodies of men produced retinues of men under contract at set rates of pay, and any deficiencies were punished financially. For example, the Duke of Gloucester, who was the king's own brother, was 2 men short of his contracted number of 200 lances and 600 mounted archers, and the king refused to pay him for a year, forcing the Duke to pay for the men himself. By the way, the term lance meant not just an armed warrior with a lance, but also 1 or more horses to go with him, plus servants and retainers, depending on the rank of the individual. So, for example, a duke was personally expected to bring with him to campaign 50 horses, and he was paid 13 shillings and 4pence per day. Each knight was expected to bring 6 horses and was paid 2 shillings a day, while an archer was paid 2pence per day. Well, the entire army embarked in 1,500 ships and sailed on the 11th of August, anchoring in the River Seine estuary 3 miles from Harfleur on the 13th of August. There were 2,500 men-at-arms, 5,000 archers, of whom half were mounted, 10,000 horses, there was siege equipment, and around 1,000 assorted supporting staff, consisting of farriers, miners, cannon gun crews, armourers, bowyers, fletchers, masons, shoemakers, carters, cooks, and chaplains. Well, it took 2 days to disembark that lot, and at the end of that, Harfleur was besieged by King Henry with support from his brother, Thomas of Lancaster, the first Earl of Clarence. And Clarence captured a French relief convoy, but he was unable to prevent 300 French reinforcements slipping into the town to bolster the 100 men-at-arms already there. Now, the town defences were quite formidable. There were 26 towers set into the substantial walls, and the surrounding area was largely flooded. Well, the town was subjected to English bombardment by cannon, and when the partially destroyed main bastion was captured, the town agreed to surrender in order to avoid being sacked. The siege of Harfleur had lasted 5 weeks, but the cost to the English was high. Only some 36 men were actually killed in the fighting, but dysentery killed 2,000 men and caused a further 2,000 to be invalided back to England. Well, King Henry now had to garrison Harfleur with 500 men-at-arms and 1,000 archers. So it's hardly a chevauchée in the manner that I described earlier on. So he was left with a deployable army of only around 6,000 men, not really enough to do much useful with, one would have thought. Yet Henry was a determined man. First of all, he challenged the Dauphin, the Crown Prince of France, to single combat for the throne of France, but unfortunately, the Dauphin was fat and idle, and he sensibly refused. Then, against the advice of his council of war, Henry set off on the 8th of October with his army of 900 men-at-arms and 5,000 archers on a 100-mile march to Calais, because Calais was in English hands. He took no cannon with him, and he carried provisions for only 8 days. And of course, unlike Sir Laurence Olivier shown here, he didn't have a film crew either. Well, Henry followed the line of the coast on the obvious route to Calais. The French strategy was one of containment. They were wary of a pitched battle, but they did want to prevent Henry from reaching Calais. And in order to reach Calais, Henry needed to cross the River Somme. And while some of the French forces followed him, others began to close off the bridges and the fords along the river. Henry's intention was to cross at Blanchetaque, and that was a well-established ford, but the French managed to assemble enough men on the north bank at Blanchetaque on the 13th of October to prevent his crossing there. Interestingly, Blanchetaque would have been well known to the English because it was steeped in folklore, for in 1346, Henry's great-grandfather, Edward III, had forced a crossing here against fearful odds on his journey to victory at Crécy. Well, Henry now moved east past Amiens, and he would have been unable to besiege Amiens anyway, because he'd left all his siege engines behind in Harfleur. It seems that Henry's course of action was definitely as rash and unwise as his advisors had warned back at Harfleur. The French were carefully blocking every crossing site, and the English food supplies must have begun to run low. And of course, nevertheless, the English were efficiently emptying any French storehouses they came across, but they didn't come across very many, because the French operated a scorched earth policy to deny the English supplies. Well, however, despite this gloomy outlook for the English, strict discipline was maintained by Henry. There was no drunkenness. One man caught stealing from a church was hanged. Then, in a stroke of genius, or possibly as a result of careful scouting, Henry struck out across a great loop of the river rather than following the river slavishly. And on the 19th of October, the army arrived at Voyenne, where he found two narrow fords, which were only knee to waist height in depth, and there was no French force to defend the site. He quickly threw an advance guard across and started crossing the army. It took almost all day to cross, and it was incredibly vulnerable during that time. And knowing this, Henry personally regulated the flow of men and horses across one of the two fords. Well, why the French did not rush to attack Henry at this most vulnerable time is a mystery. The French advance guard was not very far away, but it's likely that it was not considered strong enough in itself to defeat Henry, and it needed the main part of the French army. And anyway, why would the French rush to battle when they were steadily building up their strength? Their main army now made its way to Bapaume. There's another picture of the river there. Shouldn't think it's changed very much. And it arrived there on the 20th of October and was joined by the advance guard from Péronne, and created a unified army. Potentially, this combined force produced one 50,000-man strong army, which might outnumber the English almost 10 to 1, although actually they never quite managed to achieve their 50,000. Well, Henry allowed his army to rest on the 20th at the village of Atty, and he was visited there by French heralds who informed him that his army would not be allowed to reach Calais, but would be confronted before he got there. Henry replied that he didn't actually seek battle. He simply wanted to get to Calais, but he was not afraid of battle, and he warned the heralds that if there was battle, there would be heavy French casualties. Well, through the night of the 21st and 22nd of October, the English army moved steadily northwest, bypassing Bapaume through countryside, which, of course, their descendants would bitterly fight for 501 years later in the Battle of the Somme in World War I. Henry crossed the small river Ternoise at Blangy, with the French army generally moving in parallel. By now, the French had gathered in every available man, And on the 24th of October, they moved ahead of the English and blocked their route to Calais at Azincourt, where the road ran between two woods. And so was set the scene for one of the greatest battles in history. Henry halted for the night at a village you can see marked out there called Maisoncelles, which was a mile to the southeast of Azincourt, or Agincourt as it is known in English, and I will call it Agincourt. Quite frankly, the English army was exhausted. It had marched 300 miles in 16 days, and for the past few days, it had been raining steadily with a bitterly cold wind. The army had very little food left, and dysentery was still rife. Henry gave orders that his men were to remain silent, and those caught making a noise would be punished as follows. Gentlemen would suffer confiscation of horse and armor, which was an enormous amount, and common soldiery would lose their right ear. Well, by contrast, only a mile away, the French camp was ablaze with the light of campfires, and there was much drinking, shouting, and singing. But this was not the only difference between the two armies. There was, of course, the enormous disparity in numbers. There were 25,000 French versus 6,000 English. And there was also a vital spiritual disparity. In the English army, there was a powerful feeling of national identity. They were all there, gentlemen or common soldier, facing the same mortal threat, and they believed in the rightness of their king's cause. The English army and its conduct at this time was a fascinating mixture of heroic leadership and camaraderie, together with some callous disregard for the human life of its enemies, and a little bit of lust for money from enemy purses and from ransoms. And of course, whatever each man's motivation in the army was, there was the stark fact that there was nowhere to hide. Battle was inevitable and must be faced. Time for the English had run out. Well, King Henry heard mass and took communion before arming himself for battle. Like his men-at-arms, he wore full armor, and like most of them, he carried a broadsword plus a dagger. Some of the men-at-arms carried maces or poleaxes. The archers, by comparison, were lightly clad. They wore a leather jerkin, sometimes with steel plates and an open-faced helmet, sometimes a metal-reinforced cap or a chainmail hood. They carried short swords and daggers. Some of them had mallets, which they needed to drive in the protective stakes to ward off cavalry. Most probably, the formation adopted by Henry was of a single group of some 900 men-at-arms, all on foot, occupying much of the ground between the woods of Agincourt and Tramcourt. In addition, the 5,000 archers were split between the two flanks bordering the woods. However, we can't be absolutely sure, and some historians argue that there were parties of archers in between groups of men-at-arms. Well, whatever the case, Henry now addressed the army and declared that he would not ask for ransom, but he would fight to the death instead. Let's now take a quick look at the ground. You can see the mainly open ground gently rising up towards the English position with a wood to the flank. This photo shows the narrowest part between the two woods, and this wood shows you that the wood itself would have been impenetrable to a cavalry charge. Curiously, despite their overwhelming numbers, the French made no attempt to attack. Henry probably realized that his army's precarious morale would evaporate if they continued to do nothing. And so he ordered his army to advance and halted it a long bow shot from the nearest enemy. And that at that point, the gap between the woods was at its narrowest. Here on the flanks, the archers drove in their stakes and they waited for the French. Well, whilst moving forward like this, the English army was dangerously vulnerable, and yet again, it's almost unbelievable that the French did not take their opportunity to attack at this stage, but they didn't. And did they have a plan? Well, interestingly, they did. They had the experience of Crécy and Poitiers, and there is documentary evidence of a French plan to deal with the archers by deploying detachments of mounted knights specifically tasked to sweep round the flanks and to destroy the archers. Unfortunately for the French, as I've mentioned, the ground simply didn't allow this tactic to be effectively employed because the woods on each flank denied any outflanking maneuvers against the archers. In the event, the French army of somewhere between 25 and 30,000 men was drawn up in 3 divisions or battles, one behind the other. The first battle was under the command of the Constable of France and included the Dukes of Bourbon and Orléans. There were 8,000 men-at-arms and 4,000 archers with 1,500 crossbowmen immediately following them, all in the first battle. And there were several hundred mounted knights on the flanks trying to deal with the English archers. Thus, the first battle, the first of the 3 French battles, alone outnumbered the English by over 2 to 1. Well, following behind this enormous host was the second battle, with some 6,000 men-at-arms, and then the third battle with a further 8 to 10,000 men-at-arms. The first battle was now under sporadic English arrow fire, which caused some death, injury, and considerable French frustration in the failure to advance. Finally, the French first battle advanced, and it advanced confidently. And watching them was the 58-year-old steward of the royal household, Sir Thomas Erpingham. Erpingham had carried the king's sword at his coronation, and now he was given the responsibility of ordering the archers to let fly. And he did this by tossing his baton in the air, an action that was spotted by the carefully watching commanders of the various groups of archers, who immediately passed on the word to let fly. And an arrow storm now tore into the advancing French. And their 2 flanking cavalry formations couldn't get through the woods, and they were also subjected to the arrow storm. And these flanking units, by the way, were well below the planned numbers, and we think this is because many French knights and nobles refused to accept the insulting role of fighting common archers, and they had abandoned those 2 formations to go into the main body in the centre for the glory of attacking the English centre. As explained earlier on, the woods prevented a proper flanking cavalry move, and the English archers, protected behind their defensive stakes and employing an enfilading fire, virtually annihilated the 2 groups of cavalry. Surviving horses bolted back into the sides and the rear of the first battle, causing some chaos and panic. But nevertheless, the French first battle struggled on through the mud. And by the way, this is a recent photograph taken of the battle site, which shows typical October mud. And the shower of English arrows might by this stage have been stepped up to a rate of 80,000 arrows a minute for a short period. Tired, if not exhausted, the French reached the English front line, the men-at-arms in the front line, but were unable to make any impression. The French casualties rose swiftly, and soon they became enormous. Contemporary accounts tell of mounds of dead, and it's known that many French knights died through suffocation from tripping and being submerged in a sea of armored bodies. Anybody in armor who lost his footing or fell as a result of a wound was almost certainly doomed. After less than 2 hours of fighting, the first battle had largely been destroyed, with survivors fleeing through the second battle and throwing it into chaos. The second battle, already in some confusion as a result of these fleeing troops from the first battle, had to climb over the piles of bodies, and it met the same fate as the first battle. Accounts tell of large numbers of English archers dropping their bows to dash forward and nimbly kill or capture French men-at-arms who were exhausted and almost helpless in their heavy armour. All the while, the French third battle watched all this disaster and made no move to advance. Indeed, many from the third battle began to slip away. However, the emerging outcome of an English victory was not at all obvious at this stage to King Henry.